Middle East program. Welcome to our meeting on freedom after speech, speaking up and paying the price in Egypt. It's a discussion with Sa'adeddin Ibrahim. This meeting is co-sponsored with the Freedom House, and I would like to thank Thomas Media for having thought of us and contacting us to organize this meeting. You all know Saad, but for us, he's a former public policy scholar at the center, and he knows that he has a home here anytime he is in town. And I was just telling him that this is, I think, the fourth time I'm chairing a meeting for Saad. I would leave the introduction of Saad to Thomas Melia, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Freedom House. He was previously Director of Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where he continues to teach graduate courses about democracy promotion. He has a very strong bio, which I think for the sake of time I will skip. I would just acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, who is the chairman of the board of the Wilson Center. And a special welcome also to all our new fellows and public policy scholars who I think is the first or second meeting they are attending since they have come to the center. Tom, you have the floor. You can stay there or talk there, or whichever you prefer. You would go there? Up to you.
I'll sit here.
Okay,
all right.
Please.
Thank you, Hala. And I first want to express our strong appreciation to Dr. Isfandiari and the Woodrow Wilson Center for their hospitality and co-sponsoring this event today. Although I have to confess that it was my colleague Sharif Mansour, who is a former colleague of Sa'adeddin's, who thought of the connection and has actually done a lot of work to put this meeting together. So thank you, Sharif and Rich Eisendorf and the others on the Freedom House Middle East team. And I'm very pleased to be here today with two such courageous public intellectuals. Few people in Washington can speak as knowledgeably about the ways that repressive regimes try to stifle legitimate scholarship. And I'm honored to be sitting on this stage today with two courageous scholars such as are seated before you here. Who knew that in the 21st century, scholarship would require not just intellectual aptitude, but political, physical, and moral courage? But here we are in the 21st century, where the public intellectuals who we admire the most are actually in physical danger from time to time, and so our admiration for them only is enhanced by their commitment to their scholarship and the principles that they speak to. I want to say two things about Sa'adeddin Ibrahim. The first is that I met him in September, I think it was, of 1995, long after he had become famous as a human rights researcher, advocate, and activist. It was a few weeks before the 1995 legislative elections in Egypt. 5 weeks, I think it was now. And I was then the Middle East Regional Director for the National Democratic Institute, and was visiting Cairo as part of a growing effort by us at NDI to expand our contacts in the Middle East. We had programs underway in Palestine and in Yemen, and we kept changing planes going through Cairo to go other places, and finally we realized that we should stop there and actually meet some Egyptians other than airport personnel. And so we arranged in the course of an exploratory trip to Lebanon to spend 2.5 days in Cairo. And in those couple of days, we met with the various political parties, including the General Secretary of the National Democratic Party, and various human rights groups and civic leaders. It was a jammed 2.5 days. Many of you have been on those kinds of visits. And in the course of it, we gave to some of the people we met an Arabic language translation of a booklet that we had just published at NDI, which was a guide to organizing domestic nonpartisan election observers, based on the experience of these kinds of groups on every continent by that time. By the mid-90s, there was a large body of work in how citizens could come together to see if their government and election authorities played by the rules that were established in their countries. And we took that booklet and we translated it into Arabic, mostly for our visit to Lebanon. But we had a few copies left in the briefcase as we spent our last couple of days in Cairo. And so we gave them out to people a month before the legislative elections. And in all of those conversations, we said, well, of course, there's no time to do this here in Egypt before the legislative elections, but, it's something to think about for next time, and, we can talk about why it's useful and why it may be appropriate for Egypt. The very last meeting that we had was at the Ibn Khaldun Center, because if I recall correctly, it was kind of on the way to the airport. And so we had our luggage in our car, and we had our last meeting, and we went to the Ibn Khaldun Center to meet the famous Saeed Ibrahim. And when we got there, and we knocked on the door and were brought into the reception area, and he came out after a few minutes, and he said, "Come on, we've been waiting for you." And so we go into the conference room, and he had in there about half of the people that we'd met with in the previous 2 days. And they all had their copies of the Arabic language domestic election monitoring handbook. And without any introduction or any how do you do, Dr. Saad said, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it next month. And I said, no, you don't understand. This is complicated. This takes time. This is a big project. You can't just do this. And he said, no, we've been talking about it for the last hour, and we're ready to do it. And we've got 5 groups here, and we're going to form the Independent Commission for Election Reform, ICER. And we're going to announce tomorrow or Monday or whenever that we're doing this, and we're going to monitor next month's elections. And how are you going to help us? And I said, well, we got to do a proposal and a grant, and we don't have any money for this, and we're leaving in an hour. So good luck. Sorry, we said, well, we'll do what we can. It's rare that we have people that seize upon an idea as quickly and as thoroughly as Dr. Saad and his colleagues did. We came back to Washington the next day and immediately went to the National Endowment for Democracy, talked to Mark Plattner and Carl Gershman and Barbara Haig and others there, and we arranged for an emergency $25,000 grant to be processed so that we could get money to Cairo to enable this little project to go forward. And it did. It did quite famously, in fact. In the month between then, when they announced themselves, and when the elections came, there was a firestorm in the Egyptian press. This effort to monitor the elections in Egypt by citizens of Egypt was called by the foreign ministry the work of devils and other kinds of crazy, outlandish language. And so I did what we do when we have governments complaining and denouncing our work as civic activists. After we reaffirm that we're not pawns of the U.S. government and we don't want to be told by them what to do, we go ask them for help. And so we went first to our friends in the Congress who knew NDI and knew this kind of work. And I see a guy named Mike Van Dusen in the back of the room there. He was then the chief of staff for the senior Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I called up Mike and said, would Chairman Hamilton be willing to weigh in support of this and sort of try to urge the Egyptian government to let us go ahead with this and let the Egyptians go ahead and monitor their own elections? And Mike gave me a little recitation of all the issues in U.S.-Egyptian relations that were then in play and why this was going to be complicated and painful and difficult. And then, of course, he concluded by saying, of course, I'll talk to the chairman. And so he went to Congressman Hamilton, and letters were produced and sent to the foreign minister and to the embassy here and to the U.S. embassy out there, and a broader effort among legislators in Washington, friends of Egypt, all of them, to try to speak reason to the Egyptian government was underway. And meanwhile, they went ahead. They mobilized what turned out to be 600 observers in Egypt in, I think, if I recall correctly, 88 constituencies, not everywhere in the country, but in some key areas. And they went out and they monitored the elections, and they produced very thorough, lawyerly reports that were circulated in Egypt and in the region and around the world. And it became a basis for subsequent efforts to talk about how to reform the election process in Egypt, a process that, of course, is still underway. But that was my introduction to Dr. Saad. So I'm here to report to you today that he is a man who is quick with an idea, able to mobilize people and lead people and organizations to do difficult things, as well as to be a courageous writer and thinker and publicist on the ideas of democracy and human rights. And at the risk of delaying his remarks, I want to just quote one more thing. I'm not going to recite his long biography, his 14 book titles, his many articles, his several imprisonments, and all that, because I think that people in this room are well aware of his body of work. But one of the things at Freedom House that we are proud of is that we associated ourselves with Dr. Ibrahim back in 2002 when he was awarded the Betty Bow Lord Award for Writing in Defense of Liberty. And on that occasion, while he was in prison, his wife came to accept the honor in his behalf. And I want to just read one short excerpt from the remarks that were delivered that day, October 21, 2002, by Betty Bow Lord, who was then the chair of the Board of Trustees of Freedom House. She said, "Every dissident who wields the written word as an instrument for democratic change has his or her own special voice. Dr. Ibrahim's voice is that of a scholar. He advances freedom with hard evidence, facts, and convincing analysis. He digs deep to mine issues about which the Egyptian government is especially sensitive. Sensitive because their hidden truths challenge the image drawn and gilded by the regime, namely that Egypt is, in fact, a modern and tolerant society, an island of liberalism within a sea of autocracies."
I just need to mention also that Saad Ibrahim is the recipient of many awards, including the 2006 Ian Ratu Democracy Award, which is usually given at the Wilson Center, and he was the first recipient of that award, and I think he has been in touch with the Ratu people all along. Saad, you have the floor. You don't have to get, it's up to you.
Do you want me to stand up or? Okay, I'll stand up in due respect to you. Thank you. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be back here. And thank you, Hala, thank you, Tom, for such a hospitable, generous introduction. I know quite a few of you, so it is a pleasure. It's a homecoming for me. And my recent conviction was only 4 weeks ago. So I am now technically a fugitive. And if the minute I go back to Egypt, if I do, I will be arrested and thrown back in prison. And that will be my fourth imprisonment. My case has been a high-profile case. So many people around Egypt, the region, and the world know about it. What they do not know is that there are so many others who have been victimized by this regime for precisely the same reason. When they spoke truth to power, power did not like it, and they reacted with rage. The most recent of which are a series of journalists, reporters, who in the course of doing their work or writing on their own investigative journalism were subjected to indictment, arrest, sometimes abuse, torture, and ultimately thrown again before state security courts, which invariably convicts them to anywhere from a year to 3 years for just simply speaking truth to power. I'm grateful, of course, that at least my relatively high-profile case is giving me the chance to pay respect to something like 20,000 Egyptians, prisoners of conscience, who are rotting in prison, some of whom for as many as 15 years without trial, without trial, just on administrative detention. Something that my lawyers a year ago warned me against, since the hate campaign immediately started after an initiative, one of my new initiatives that I took by helping to establish the Arab Democracy Foundation in the state of Qatar. The regime considered that as a hostile act, just to start a foundation that has the word democracy in it. They took that to be targeting the Mubarak regime, not a foundation that is promoting a freedom agenda in the whole region, but the paranoia of the Mubarak regime made them think that this whole thing is part of a big conspiracy in which Qatari money, American power, and a stooge like myself are engaged in regime change in Egypt. And accordingly, the hate campaign proceeded, escalated, and then some of the cronies of the ruling party, the NDP, began to file lawsuits against me in courts. The number of these suits have reached 21, and while many of them are still in litigation, one, as I said in the beginning of this talk, passed the ruling on May 2nd, 2008, and that is the first of 20 of one of those cases. So there are still more to come, and we figured that if I'm convicted in all the charges, I will serve probably as many as 60 years in prison, which I do not mind if I can live 60 more years. But anyhow, that is the situation. While after this latest conviction, I have been reading about other people. Some of you probably heard about the case of Imad al-Kabir, who not only was detained, tortured, but his torturers apparently enjoyed what they were doing, and they wanted to record it for posterity. So everything was recorded by the officers who were doing the torture. And some fluke, somebody got hold of that film. And when the film of the torture circulated, it was a big scandal in Egyptian legal and security circles that the government had to try the officers involved, and in fact to convict one of them to 3 years. Now, the journalist who blew the whistle on that episode last week was subjected to harassment, to arrest, and to torture in revenge for what he had done a year and a half ago and resulted in the conviction of one of their fellow officers. So this is just one or two of the episodes that illustrates how the Mubarak regime has been hounding and muffling, suppressing, and eliminating sometimes some of the dissidents in Egypt. Now, the two questions that I'd like to answer in the time I have allowed is, how does he get away with it and still enjoy the good reception and the goodwill of many of the Western democracies, including the United States, a country that has been very generous with him, giving him something like $2 billion every year. $2 billion every year in aid. Other Western democracies, Europe to Japan, give him another $2 billion every year. So for the last 27 years of his tenure, he has been getting, on the average, anywhere from $4 to $5 billion in foreign aid. Very little to show for this amount of foreign aid. Egyptians are suffering. We have now a new expression in Egypt called the bread martyrs. You have the martyrs, the suicide bombers. Now we have a new expression because in the long lines fighting over bread, a basic food for Egyptians, people sometimes get into violent quarrels of who will get first, who will get the bread first, that in one of those episodes, some 15 people were killed in food lions, bread lions, in front of public sector bakeries. So people are asking legitimately the question, where is all of this money going? At a time when the Egyptian economy also is doing fairly well in the last 5 years, growing at the average of 6 to 7%. Why isn't a country like Egypt with that growth rate, with economic growth rate, and with this amount of foreign aid, why can't feed its own people? That is a big question that nobody in Egypt has been adequately able to answer. And in the process, when writers, journalists point out and speak out, as many have done, as I have done, then they are harassed, hounded, indicted, tried, and thrown in prison. So I don't want my case to be, or to overshadow the so many cases, some of whom are far more courageous, some of whom have suffered far more than I did. And let me just tell you some of the episodes that the Mubarak regime has perfected in recent years. After my first incarceration and after the big publicity surrounding it, they have learned. And they have learned, one of the things that they have learned is not to get directly involved in harassing dissidents, but to get members of the ruling NDP, National Democratic Party, to file cases as citizens against, quote unquote, the traitors. People like myself is counted by NDP members as a traitor. And actually many of the 21 cases against me have been filed by members of the ruling NDP. So when Mubarak is in a press conference or in a visit abroad, and he's asked about the case, my case, or about Ayman Noor's case, or about many other cases, he says, I have nothing to do with it. The government has nothing to do with it. These are citizens who are using their constitutional right to litigate. الحق في التقاضي, which is a constitutional right, which is true. So they do it now through this gimmick of members of the ruling party. They are the ones who file the cases. However, the government in its own says, well, if a case is pending in court, we have to detain whoever is being litigated against for fear that he or she may escape the country. And if they cannot find the person, the wanted person, they may arrest any of his relatives as a hostage. This is being done by the Egyptian government in the year 2009. Hostage taking is another practice that the Mubarak regime has engaged in. And sometimes the torture of members of the family is practiced in front of the dissident or the protester or the critic in order to humiliate him, in order to obtain quote unquote, information from him that could help indict him or could help convict him. This is the kind of things that are taking place. Now, more recently, not only did the Egyptian government has grown impatient with critics and dissidents, but it wanted to spread the gospel to other autocratic regimes in the region. So what is the latest culprit? What is the latest target? Arab satellites, Arab television satellites, which have in the last 10 years provided the average citizen in our region with some space, some freedom of expression. Whatever you think of Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera is a prime example of this kind of a new media that has enabled average citizens all over the Arab world, from Morocco to Bahrain, to speak their minds and to speak power, to speak truth to power. And that has bothered the Egyptian government immensely. So they convene the ministers of information. Believe it or not, we still have something called the Minister of Information, something Orwellian, remind you of 1984. So in many of the Arab countries that have Minister of Information, they convened an emergency meeting last spring to come up with what they called guideline principles for regulating Arab satellite television. And there are two satellites, one from Egypt that is controlled by Egypt, the other one is controlled by Saudi Arabia. And between the two of them, they have issued these new guidelines to be able to take out of the of service any television station that does not follow the guidelines. And the guidelines basically are as restrictive as you can think of. So here is Egypt taking the lead, not only in destroying or eliminating or confining freedom of expression inside Egypt, but also doesn't want other Egyptians or Egyptians to find other outlets outside Egypt. All right, my next set of remarks has to do, how does Mubarak get away with this? Especially with countries like the United States and Western democracies. Here are the 3 or 4 ploys that he has very skillfully used. One is the issue of stability, that he somehow is a bulwark who is maintaining stability in Egypt and the region. That's something that probably we can discuss, because the region has never been as unstable as it has in the last 27 years of the Mubarak tenure. Who had ever heard of bin Laden 27 years ago? Who had ever heard of Zawahiri or Al-Qaeda? None of these. I'm talking now regionally. Even Hezbollah, all of these things, they do not exist 30 or 35 years ago. So when he talks about being the bulwark of stability and the bulwark against extremism, this is a ploy. Second ploy that he's have used skillfully is that if he allows democracy and free election too fast, then the Islamic militants or extremists will take over. And I must say that whenever I go in Western circles to speak, this is always a question. This is always a fear. This is always apprehension expressed. Oh, but you know, if you have free elections, the Muslim brothers in Egypt will take over. Look what happened in Hamas in Palestine. Look what happened elsewhere. So I say, democracy is democracy. If you believe in democracy, you have to be consistent. You have to be principled. You don't just promote democracy to bring your own or people you like, but you accept the outcome regardless, so long as people accept the rules of the game, that there will be a rotation, there will be another election, and so on. And I often give the examples from somewhere else, like Turkey, like Morocco, like Bahrain, like Kuwait, where Islamists have participated in power and have done so responsibly. So why always have this scarecrow in the case of Egypt? And people swallow it. The other ploy that he has skillfully used, that has kind of made Western democracies look the other way over some of these flagrant violations, which everybody talks about. It's not just me, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Lawyers First, Human Rights First, all of these have documented, not to mention the Egyptian and the Arab Human Rights Organization. And yet, people in Western democracies, decision makers at least, are willing to look the other way, to let him get away with it for the sake of maintaining stability or for creating that defense against would-be extremists who may sweep the country of Egypt and the region. The third or the fourth ploy that he has used skillfully is being a man of peace, promoting an Arab-Israeli peace, an Egyptian-Israeli peace, and in fact, part of the aid to Egypt has been tied from the beginning, since Camp David, back some 1977, 1978, to Egyptian-Israeli peace process. And that is something that he has continued to play as a card and to make both the American policymakers as well as the pro-Israeli lobby in this country and elsewhere in the West actually believe that he is the man who has maintained and sustained peace. I ask myself a question, and I ask you, and any friend of Israel in this audience, what has he advanced in 27 years? Not 1 inch. Whatever Sadat left has not changed, has not been amplified or advanced 1 iota beyond Mubarak. Mubarak had never visited Israel, has never encouraged actually any other country to make peace with Israel. Look at Syria, look at elsewhere. No, but he poses, and he has managed to convince everybody that he is a man of peace. When King Hussein actually had his peace agreement, the Egyptian media was very critical of King Hussein and raised all kinds of questions about possible secret deals that we don't know about. So here is a country that had signed a peace treaty with Israel. I mean, I have all kind of reservation on Israeli policy, and I can speak about that. But I'm just saying, here is a man who could have tried to answer a bigger question of how he got away with all of these violations of human rights, muffling Democrats, putting them behind bars, and yet getting away with it in the West, especially in the United States. And I'm saying this is one of the reasons. Posing as a man of peace in the region. All right. The fact that I have blown the whistle on the succession scheme that he's engaged in, trying to groom his son to follow him, was actually the serious beginning of my trouble with him. The day that my article on that issue appeared was the day I was arrested. And that was June 30th, the year 2000. Article appeared titled, the Arab contribution to political science in the 21st century. It's kind of a playful title. Gumlukiya. Gumlukiya is a hybrid Arabic word, means Republican dynasty. Gumlukiya. Ala wazn mulukhiyya. Egyptians love Mulukhiyya. And I said all of that in the article, and you discover that these people in power have no sense of humor. They did not take it lightly because it touched on the sun. And these are the 4 red lines in Egypt. Hosni Mubarak, Susan Mubarak, Gamal Mubarak, Ala Mubarak. Anyone who comes close to them will see his day in hell. And I did. The day the article was published, first the publication disappeared from the Egyptian market. And then midnight I was arrested. And I think I told the story here before, so I don't have to repeat it. But I'm just saying that this was one of the things that broke the whatever existed between me and the regime. The other one is what Tom mentioned, is monitoring the election. Monitoring the election was another red line that I dared to cross. So the 4 lines of the family, plus monitoring the election, and then there was a 5th line that I crossed, and that is my defense of minorities, especially the Coptic minority in Egypt. They consider these 3 issues as red lines, and I have crossed all of them, even though I have done so peacefully and even though transparently, but it didn't spare me or save me with the Mubarak family. So here is the reasons. Here is how Mubarak has gotten away with it. What could be done? And I'm concluding here my remarks. I often cite the example of the Helsinki Accord, 1975 Helsinki Accord. When the Soviet bloc country, the Warsaw countries, needed Western aid, Western trade, Western technology, the NATO or the Western countries said, yes, we will grant you all of the above, aid, trade, and technology, in return for opening up your system, allowing civil society to operate, allowing freedom of movement, freedom of migration. Well, these demands looked pretty fuzzy for the Soviets at the time, so they signed on the dotted line. Little did they know that within the next 5 years after Helsinki, then things began to happen in the Eastern Bloc. I told that story in a lecture I gave also here, and Hala, forgive me for the many times you have to introduce me. She also introduced me for that lecture. It is out on the table. Telling the story of Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, and what we in Egypt and the Arab world can learn from. And here I'm repeating it again very quickly, is that's what I'm demanding. That's why I asked President Bush when I saw him in Prague last year to do, is to use conditionality. Condition your aid to friendly countries in the Middle East on advancing the cause of democracy. It will be a win-win situation. A win situation for us as people who have been fighting for democracy, who feel entitled democracy like everybody else in the world, and also a win situation for the West. Because when you have a democracy, even if it's not stable instantly, ultimately in the medium run, not even in the longer run, it will become stable and will become the best friend of the West. That I told President Bush last year. That I wrote in an article in the Washington Post last year, an article that was used as the only evidence for this last charge, and again the article may be outside, in which that was used in court as evidence that I'm defaming the name of my good country abroad by publishing articles critical of the situation in Egypt. And I still asking for this kind of conditionality. It's a peaceful conditionality. Don't send guns and planes like Iraq. Just use whatever peaceful leverage you have. It will be a win-win situation. I think Egypt is a great country, great civilization. Egyptian people are a great people, but they have this despicable, oppressive, autocratic regime. And it is a regime that has created its mirror image, the theocratic extremist. So I hold the regime, in fact, responsible for creating whatever extremism we may still have in Egypt and the region. So I hope you heed these remarks. I hope you will help us as Democrats to provide the alternative to both the autocrats and theocrats. So these are my last words to you, and thank you for listening.
We have 15 minutes for questions, so please state your name, be very brief. We don't want comments, we just want questions, please. Yes, and identify yourself. You can sit if you want an answer, but as you please.
Brian Beery, I'm a reporter for Congressional Quarterly. Just to follow up on the very last sentence you said about the mirror side, the religious, the theocratic equivalent. How strong do you think are the Islamic fundamentalists in Egypt, and what exactly is their relationship with the regime?
Well, here is our own counting as a research center, the Ibn Khaldun Research Center, which has monitored, as Tom said, elections from 1995 until 2005. So we monitored all the elections from that time on. And we had the possibility of assessing the real power of if we consider fundamentalists as represented by the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers in the first election under Mubarak got 2% of the vote. In the last election, they got 20%. And it is in that sense that I say autocrats have created their mirror image, the theocrats. From 2% to 20% in 25 years under Mubarak. So far from being a bulwark against this kind of hardliners, he in fact, by his very policies, has created that kind of force. Nevertheless, I say 20% still not a majority. Even in a free and fair election, they would probably get possibly as high as 30% of the vote in Egypt. And that is our counting. This is our straw poll and surveys. And they say, well, if they have 20%, 25%, 30%, they're entitled to be partners in whatever political process we have. I'm very consistent on that. As much as I defend, let's say, because there are some Copts friends in the audience, and they have apprehensions about what I write in that respect. I'm very clear. Part of my trouble with Mubarak, actually there's two troubles I have with Mubarak. One was the defense of the right of the Muslim Brothers to be part of the mainstream politics so they can operate in the open. And the other one is my defense of the Copts. They don't like me to do either one. They wanted to keep these issues in their own with their state security agency to manipulate it to maintain the politics of fear and the politics of apprehension in Egypt and to keep the democratic process from proceeding on track.
Yes, just if you could wait for the mic. The mic is coming. Yes, please.
Thank you. Sheikh Ahmed Subhi Mansour. Dr. Saad, what the situation of the Egyptian army? Because you know Mubarak represents Egyptian army.
Yeah, thank you, Sheikh Ahmed. Even though you're not wearing a turban, but I'll accept your designation as a Sheikh Ahmed. Sheikh Ahmed Subhi Mansour was a professor, very eminent professor in Al-Azhar. And again, because he spoke his mind, he spoke truth to power, he was fired from Al-Azhar, joined us in Ibn Khaldun for a number of years, and then we were all arrested in the year 2000. He managed to slip out of the country and to take refuge here. So salute you and salute your family. Sharif is the organizer of this event, is his son. The Egyptian army is the only base that Mubarak has now to maintain his power. He is universally disliked by Egyptians nowadays. He has not always been disliked, but as he stays longer and longer and commits more and more mistakes, and episodes of corruption spread all over, some of which may be exaggerated, but these tales of corruption, oppression and corruption, have undermined his popularity. So nowadays, he has zero popularity. Or probably, let's say, to be more fair, is his own NDP that has probably something like 10 to 15% of any genuine vote. Now, how he maintains the loyalty of the army. And this was a question that President Bush asked me last year when I saw him in Prague. I said, you know, by law, nobody can raise any question about the army in the Egyptian media, by law. But to the extent that we have been able to study the situation, we found the following. The service, the law of the Officer Corps Service has been changed under Mubarak twice. A law that has been in effect from the beginning of the establishment of the modern Egyptian army in the 1920s was changed twice under Mubarak. Once in 1984, that is 3 years after his first election, which they lowered the compulsory retirement age or rank from general to major, or maybe colonel or something. Anyhow, عميد يعني. عميد يعني إيه يا دكتور؟ Colonel, yes. And then 10 years later, another amendment to the officer corps service, lowering the compulsory age one more rank down. What does this mean? That's exactly what George Bush said. What does this mean? Well, I said, Mr. President, it means there's always the last article in every amendment that says, but the president can make exceptions to the above articles, meaning that everybody will be forced to retire, except that the president can make exceptions for a number of officers. He said, why would he do that? President Bush, very high IQ. I said, you know, Mr. President, from what I could tell, that he wants to make sure that the top officer corps are loyalists, very loyal to him. And in the history of coup d'etats in the third world, it is lower ranks from major down that always stage the coup d'etats. And therefore, he makes sure, by screening the officer corps periodically, that he will only retain at the top rank people whose military intelligence tell him are truly loyal. So that is the situation. As far as we can tell, these top ranks are very loyal to him. We don't know if they will accept his son as a president, we don't know. but there is always a name that is circulating, and that is the head of the military intelligence, Omar Suleiman, who is also highly respected both in Washington and in Tel Aviv.
And the lady in the back, as a son, just right.
Thank you. Michelle Kellerman with National Public Radio. You've been telling us a little bit about your conversations with President Bush. He's talked a lot about his freedom agenda. I wonder if you think he has any legacy in this field of democracy promotion, and also whether you're worried that American public opinion has turned too much against it, given the war in Iraq.
Well, I think probably you can answer the question about the American public opinion better than I can. But I tell you what he has done to us in the region. One, he raised hopes initially. Year 2004, 2005 were years of very high expectation of American support for this freedom agenda and for the democratization of the region. However, as soon as Hamas was elected in January 2006, there was a very rapid or hasty retreat from that agenda. And in fact, that's exactly what I wrote, that he has betrayed the Arab Democrats or the Middle Eastern Democrats. And the reason why he saw me in Prague was basically to answer, because that article appeared 1 or 2 days before the Prague meeting. So his staff asked if I could come and have a short audience with President Bush, and I did. In that meeting, well, first of all, when he addressed the meeting in Prague, and the meeting was for dissidents, all dissidents from Eastern Europe and new dissidents from the Third World. And as one of those token dissidents from the Third World. And he came to the meeting. He was not on the program, but he was on his way to the G8 meeting in Germany that year, 2007, June 2007. So he dropped in, and Havel, who was our host, a former Czech president and a former dissident, of course, welcomed him. So he came and addressed the meeting, and he claimed himself to be a dissident. Bush claimed that he was also a dissident like us, complained about Washington, about the bureaucracy, and he said, look around, did I bring anybody from the State Department or from the Pentagon? No. These people are all against me and against my freedom agenda. That's why they have undermined it. And the Washington Post, of course, took him to issue with that. And one of the pieces that I hope you will find on the table as you leave is actually exactly that. Bush as a dissident. Basically, making fun of that statement. Anyhow, he assured us in Prague, he assured me in the private audience that he is still very loyal. At the time he said, I still have 18 months in office, so don't write me off, and you will see. Well, the 18 months are coming to an end, and I have seen nothing has happened. So he has, in many ways, discredited not only the U.S. intention or agenda, but he also discredited the indigenous Democrats in the process, who still associate us with the Bush administration, with American foreign policy, and so on. So yes, we are suffering from that unfulfilled promise. But 2004, 2005, there was hope, and that hope has diminished but not disappeared. So there is some progress, but not as much as we had hoped for. There is still support, but not as much as we had hoped for. And of course, we are going to keep fighting because our battle, regardless of Bush, I'm hoping that the new administration, whoever gets elected, will carry on, and will carry on in a more enlightened and principled manner.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time is off. I think we should close with this upbeat statement that you make, Saad. Thank you.